The weather was humid and extremely hot, and sniper Carlos Hathcock and his spotter John Roland Burke were tired from running around the Vietnamese jungle looking for their next prey. Still, Hathcock remained unfazed. Peering through his binoculars, the experienced gunman quietly inspected his target, a feared counter-sniper known as the Cobra that had become his nemesis while fighting against the North Vietnamese. But Hathcock was confident that the Cobra was no better than him. After all, the brave soldier had a $30,000 bounty on his head, the highest ever for an American sniper in Vietnam. After failing the first attempt, Cobra and Hathcock ran deep into the jungle in a cat-and-mouse game until the two men were within sight of each other. They then aimed their rifles at each other, and what happened next only cemented the so-called White Feather Sniper as a Marine Corps legend. Carlos Hathcock took part in 2 Vietnam tours. The 5'10", 120-pound sniper never willingly took a day off, and he volunteered for so many dangerous missions that at one point his commanding officer had no choice but to restrict him to his quarters. Hathcock mainly used the standard Winchester Model 70 .30-06 caliber rifle with an 8-power Unertl scope, and on some occasions he also used an M2 Browning machine gun. It was with his Winchester rifle that he set the record for the longest confirmed sniper dispatch at 2,500 yards, a record that remained unbroken for 35 years. As the sniper's notoriety grew among the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, the enemy started to refer to him as Du Kish Long Trang, or the White Feather Sniper. The nickname referenced the white feather that Hathcock used to carry on a white band in his bush hat. The feared sniper took so many lives that he soon had a bounty on his head. While rewards put on American snipers by the People's Army of Vietnam typically ranged from $8,000 to $2,000, Hathcock's head was worth $30,000. On one occasion, after an enemy sniper platoon was sent to hunt down the White Feather, many Marines in the same area decided to wear the distinctive white feather on their hats, thus deceiving the North Vietnamese and further complicating the counter-sniper's job. Still, while holding the record for the highest bounty, Hathcock shot and annihilated every marksman that tried to get him. Carlos Norman Hathcock II taught himself to shoot and hunt from an early age, mainly out of necessity to help feed his family. Throughout his childhood and early adolescence, Hathcock and his dog would venture deep into the Arkansas wilderness, where he pretended to be a soldier and hunted imaginary Japanese soldiers using a .22 caliber J.C. Higgins single-shot rifle that his father brought back from his service in World War II. Growing up, Hathcock dreamed of becoming a United States Marine, and he achieved it in 1959 when he enlisted in the service at 17 years old. By 1965, the young Marine had won several shooting championships and prizes, such as the Wimbledon Cup, the most prestigious award for long-range shooting. Hathcock arrived in Vietnam a year later and started his first deployment as a military policeman, protecting soldiers and resources on Army installations and enforcing military laws and regulations. However, Hathcock wanted adventures, and he soon volunteered for combat. Captain Edward James Land, an officer who pushed the Marines into preparing snipers in every platoon, personally hand-selected Carlos after learning of his sharpshooting records, and the Arkansas native then became a sniper. Hathcock was then transferred to the 1st Marine Division Sniper Platoon stationed at Hill 55, 10 miles southwest of Da Nang, where he would become a Marine Corps legend and the Vietnam War's most lethal sniper. Hathcock was not the only infamous sniper lurking within the Vietnam jungle. There was also an alleged female platoon leader, interrogator, and sniper on the Viet Cong side that the Marines nicknamed Apache, and she was known for her sadistic methods while operating in the Vietnamese jungles long before Hathcock arrived. According to several accounts, Apache was as beautiful as she was lethal, and she was not only known for her leadership and sniper skills, but also for her propensity towards torturing American GIs. It is said that she would often place herself and her victims near U.S. Army bases to ensure that the other American officers could hear the agonizing screams. Apache and her crew operated around Hill 55, which was Hathcock's base, and her weapon of choice was a 7.62mm Model 44 Russian-made Mosin Nagant rifle with a scope. In November of 1966, after taking the life of one of his closest comrades, Hathcock searched the vast landscape for the sniper, but kept returning every night with no news. It is said that late one afternoon, Captain Edward James Land spotted a small-framed Vietnamese woman carrying a rifle that fit Apache's description, accompanied by 5 Viet Cong armed guerrilla members. As the American duo approached the group, Hathcock and Land treaded carefully and waited for the right time to shoot. Finally, as the woman squatted down to relieve herself, Land called in an artillery barrage on the group of Vietnamese snipers. Realizing that they were being ambushed, the group started running towards them as they were being shot, and Captain Land ordered Hathcock to take her down. According to accounts, Hathcock quickly attacked Apache with his Winchester sniper rifle, and as the woman fell to the ground, he shot 1 extra bullet at her for good measure. Afterward, the men stared at each other in disbelief, and a few seconds later, the silence turned into screams and laughter. They had just put down the most lethal woman in Vietnam. Carlos Hathcock was constantly chased by another North Vietnamese, known as the Cobra, a feared counter-sniper that used a powerful Machine Nagant 9130 rifle with a scope. The feared gunman had made it his personal mission to take down Hathcock, and took several other Marines in the process, including a gunnery sergeant outside of Hathcock's own living quarters. Hathcock later recalled that upon finding his fallen comrade on the floor, quote, "I took a vow right there and then. I was gonna get him, some way or another." The American recognized that Cobra was skilled, and it was only a matter of time before one took the other down. However, he was confident that as good as his enemy was, he was not better than him. One day, Hathcock and his spotter, John Roland Burke, departed base with their gear and began to trail the enemy sniper in the Vietnamese jungle near their firebase, Hill 55. As the Cobra spotted Hathcock and his team, he silently aimed at the American sniper. However, Hathcock accidentally fell over a tree, and the shot missed, hitting Burke's canteen instead. After failing the shot, Cobra left his position and ran deep into the jungle, and the 2 opposing marksmen and their spotters ended up on the opposite sides of where they'd started. Unfortunately for the North Vietnamese, they were now facing the sun, and a glimmer of light reflected off the sniper's scope. Upon spotting the glint within the bushes, Hathcock immediately took his rifle and fired at his nemesis. Then, upon approaching his victim, he was shocked to find out that his bullet went straight through the Cobra's scope, hitting the counter-sniper right between the eyes. Hathcock then took possession of the counter-sniper's rifle, hoping to take it home as a trophy. However, the weapon was eventually stolen from the base's armory. Believing that Hathcock was burned out after his recurring dangerous missions, the top American officials decided to discharge the sniper in 1967. However, he re-enlisted after only 1 week back at home with his wife and child. The Patriot wasn't trained on anything else and was a Marine through and through, wishing to continue protecting his country and his comrades. Hathcock was then assigned to the rifle teaching team in Quantico, Virginia, but he wasn't happy there and was eventually sent back to Vietnam, taking command of a sniper platoon. On September 16, 1969, the LVT-5 amphibious armored fighting vehicles he and his team were riding struck an anti-tank mine along Highway 1, north of landing zone Baldy. The vehicle burst into flames immediately. Determined to save as many lives as possible, Hathcock went back and forth and kept enduring the flames as he pulled 7 Marines from the blazing vehicle before collapsing in a rice paddy, unaware of his own injuries. Several other Marines then came to his rescue and placed him in water. Hathcock and the 7 rescued Marines he pulled from the vehicle were then evacuated by helicopter to the hospital vessel USS Repose. They were then taken to a naval hospital in Japan, and at last to the burn center at Brooke Army Medical Center in Texas. The incident left him with burns on 43% of his body, some of which were 3rd degree, thus ending his career as a sniper. While in recovery, Hathcock received the Purple Heart, followed by a Silver Star for his brave performance in the amphibious tractor incident. The Marines tried to retire him once again that same year, but they had no luck. The still young 27-year-old desperately wanted to fight, even though he was walking with a limp and beginning to suffer from mobility issues. As such, the top brass decided to send him to Spain to work as a gunnery sergeant on the USS Simon Lake submarine tender. However, when a new commander arrived at the vessel in 1975, he was stunned to find that Hathcock could no longer move without help. The sniper was then sent to the hospital, where his doctors revealed a grim diagnosis. He was suffering from multiple sclerosis. After receiving the terrible news, Carlos Hathcock moved back to Quantico's Marine Base, where he helped establish the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, providing sniper instructions to police departments and select military units, including SEAL Team 6. Because of his multiple injuries and his evolving disease, Hathcock was continuously in pain, but dedicated himself to teaching a new generation of snipers. However, his health continued to deteriorate, and in 1979, the legendary sniper collapsed while teaching a class. With no more mobility, and only 55 days short of his 20th anniversary of enlistment, the beloved instructor was forced to retire. Carlos Hathcock remains a legend among the U.S. Marine Corps, and even has an award named in his honor, the Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock Award. Presented annually, this award was established to, quote, recognize an individual who has made significant contributions in operational employment and tactics of small arms weapon systems, which have impacted the readiness and capabilities of the U.S. military or law enforcement. Hathcock would say during an interview that he only survived as a sniper because of his ability to get into a concentration bubble, putting himself into a state of complete, utter, and absolute focus with his equipment and his environment, where every breeze and every leaf meant something, then also focusing on his target. In the end, Hathcock had almost 100 confirmed lethal hits of Viet Cong personnel and North Vietnamese. However, such actions had to be confirmed by a third party during the conflict, and it had to be by someone other than the sniper's spotter. These third parties were not always present, making confirmations quite tricky, especially when the target was behind enemy lines, as was commonly the case in Vietnam. Hathcock estimated that the actual amount varied between 300 and 400 enemy personnel during the war. Despite his undeniable efficiency, the sniper always stated that he didn't enjoy the slaughter, and that the only thing on his mind whenever he went on a mission was protecting as many Americans as possible. It was the night before one of the most transcendental military invasions in human history, and hundreds of C-47 sky trains darted across the English Channel, carrying thousands of brave paratroopers about to face the darkest chapter of their lives. The warplanes carried a group of paratroopers unlike any other, with mohawk haircuts and tribal face paint. The outfit, led by the rebellious and untamed Jake McNasty McNiece, laughed and joked even as their aircraft was engulfed by fierce German flak fire. As the Skytrain lost altitude, McNiece orders his men to prepare for the jump. The lights inside the cabin then turned red, and the men scrambled to their feet amid fire and thunder. As McNiece and his comrade Willie made it to the door, flak burst through the warplane's belly, hitting Willie's backpack and unraveling his parachute inside the plane. Now significantly damaged, the C-37 continued to lose altitude as Willie desperately tried to gather his parachute and move away from the door so other paratroopers could jump. McNiece then jumped into the flak-lit skies over France, and the Skytrain exploded in midair only a few seconds later. There was no time to mourn, as McNiece and the rest of the notorious Filthy 13 outfit were now behind enemy lines in Normandy, and they had a crucial mission to finish. Jake McNiece grew up during the depths of the Great Depression and had to work to support his family from the age of 10. Hunting and fishing to feed his kin gave the young man a formidable physical condition that helped him stand out when he finally went back to school. In high school, McNiece joined the football team and found work as a fireman. He soon earned a reputation for being a defiant teen who would do anything to win. One of his teachers would remember him, quote, "He was not afraid of the devil and was always doing the unconventional thing." Soon after McNiece's graduation, the U.S. entered World War II. Then, after a nasty brawl in his hometown in Oklahoma, where he beat a man to a pulp, he decided to enlist to get the police off his back. McNiece did not want to join the infantry, and instead decided to join the emerging U.S. paratrooper experiment. He figured he would be dropped deep inside enemy lines and obey no one while engaging German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. He would later say, quote, "If a man wanted to kill me, I wanted to look him in the eye." And thus, the mischievous Jake McNiece became the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment's problem. Including paratrooper units in the U.S. military was a risky and ambitious experiment, as the American authorities knew many troopers would not make it to the ground alive. The recruiter told McNiece as such when he asked to join, going as far as letting him know that only 10 out of 1,000 would-be paratroopers made it past the excruciating physical training. Still, McNiece excelled during training and quickly became the best recruit in his unit. But he was as reckless as he was fit, and soon became known around the camp for his defiant antics. Afraid that he would influence other recruits, McNiece was put into a particular troublemaker unit, where 5 would-be paratroopers were assigned to a single tent. The accommodations were derelict, with the tents having no flooring besides the muddy dirt of the Georgian countryside. But McNiece and his men didn't care about appearances, opting to save water for cooking instead of cleaning themselves, and soon earning the nickname of the Dirty Five. McNiece and the Dirty Five continued to gain a reputation as rebels, missing roll calls, getting drunk, and participating in bar brawls regularly. One night, after causing a significant fight inside a bar, 2 military police officers intervened. When the MPs started to beat one of McNiece's friends into submission, he assaulted them, disarmed them, and fired in every direction to empty the guns, leaving the officers injured and perplexed. McNiece was severely punished, and was the only recruit not to be promoted during his training. Still, the authorities knew he was the best, and they needed him. When someone suggested to McNiece's commander that they should discharge him, he responded, quote, "McNiece isn't hurting anything. There will be a time when you'll be awful glad to have McNiece around." By the time they made it to England, the Dirty Five had grown into the Filthy 13. The group then continued rehearsing jumps in preparation for the Normandy landings. Even out of combat, McNiece had lost several friends to parachute malfunctions. Still, the Filthy 13 relished in the danger and risk that came with the job, and when they were not jumping out of a plane, they were causing mayhem in camp as their way to let off steam. During an advanced demolition training session a few days before D-Day, McNiece set up a charge in a nearby tree that was triggered when a soldier on patrol walked by, sending the man into a panic. The top brass arrested the entire group, but they were released to take part in the Normandy operations. The 13 men had now formed a unique and feared unit. Before taking off for Normandy, the men saw McNiece wearing face paint and a mohawk haircut. He told them he was part Indian, and it was part of his cultural and spiritual heritage. The paint, he said, would be an excellent camouflage once they were behind enemy lines. In truth, only part of the story was genuine. Jake's mother was half Choctaw, but everything else was made up. Encouraged by McNiece, the men cut their hair and painted their faces. They then boarded the warplane, sporting a daunting look that would be spread around the world as the press released images of the peculiar warriors about to be thrown into Nazi-occupied France. Everyone wanted to know what the Filthy 13 were really capable of. Before deploying, McNiece's mission was shifted. The task he'd been assigned was changed into a much more vital role. He and his men had to blow up the bridges below the Douve Canal and then capture and hold the main bridge. The crucial mission required additional support, and McNiece asked for 6 more paratroopers, knowing that he would lose at least half his men during the jump. The unit took off from England at 11 p.m. on June 5, 1944, along with nearly 1,000 other C-47s, loaded with thousands of paratroopers. They enjoyed a clear and bright night for about 20 minutes, before seeing the first flak set off around them. The following minutes were hectic and savage for the young paratroopers. Their aircraft was heavily engaged and losing altitude, forcing them to jump prematurely. McNiece barely escaped from the plane before it exploded, and many of his friends lost their lives, including Willie, whose parachute had been unfurled by enemy fire. The entire paratrooper operation was plagued with tragedy, and half the troopers that took off from Britain would never return. It was no different for the Filthy 13, and McNiece lost over half of his men during the jump and the minutes after that. Still, 3 of the surviving men managed to reunite on the war-torn fields of Normandy, and they were joined by 12 other U.S. paratroopers who had been separated from their units. From the moment they landed, they were targeted by German soldiers, and they had to react quickly and defend themselves. The Americans identified themselves by the sound of their rifles in contrast to German fire. As such, they were able to regroup and repel the Germans. Once they were on their feet again, McNiece and his men managed to reach the main Douve Canal, blow up some smaller bridges, and move to the main bridge. The objective was to capture and hold it so it could be used by American troops. If they could not keep the crossing, they had orders to blow it up so the Germans could not use it to reinforce the beachheads. Against all odds, the Filthy 13 dug in on one side of the bridge and maintained control, preventing the Germans from crossing. Then, after 3 days of holding the bridge, under constant German fire from the other side of the canal, the U.S. authorities decided that McNiece's unit had been wiped out and sent a squadron of P-51 Mustangs to blow out the bridge. The Mustangs swept in and destroyed the bridge, while also striking the German and U.S. positions on each side of the canal. McNiece and his men were well dug in and survived the strike, after which they continued to defend their positions. 2 days passed, and the Germans were significantly pushed back from the beachheads. A large group of Germans was then trapped in a flooded area near where McNiece and his men were positioned. There were over 700 enemy soldiers, and McNiece had managed to assemble a team of 40. Fortunately, the German commanders sent a messenger asking McNiece to surrender, thus avoiding a complete wipeout. However, McNiece responded by saying they would never yield, but were more than welcome to submit to them. The German officer was livid and felt insulted, so he decided to attack. McNiece then ordered his men to hold their fire until most Germans left their trenches. By now, Jake had machine guns, mortars, and all the equipment he needed for a formidable defense. Still, when the Germans were midway in their charge towards McNiece, he ordered his men to open fire. The onslaught was devastating for the Germans, and McNiece claims to have taken the lives of nearly 700 enemy soldiers. The Filthy 13 were made up of over 30 different men throughout the war, and continued to wreak havoc on the Germans while enjoying every minute of it. Despite grave injuries and incredibly antagonizing odds, McNiece survived and accomplished numerous missions. He credits his rebellious attitude and daredevil approach to his survival. Paratroopers were already some of the best, most aggressive U.S. soldiers in the war, and McNiece took that perception and scaled it up to become a genuinely fearsome threat to the Axis powers. McNiece's father would later comment about his son's war accomplishments, quote, "I think he was trying to build upon the idea that if they're scared of us as crazy paratroopers, well, this just makes us look crazier." McNiece became one of the only paratroopers to make 4 wartime jumps and live to tell the tale. After Normandy, he jumped as part of Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. Then he was dropped in Germany before the Battle of the Bulge for reconnaissance duty. As the war waned, he volunteered for Pathfinder training, anticipating he would sit out the rest of the war in a training camp in England. To his surprise, his unit was called for one last jump into Bastogne to guide and resupply drops. He was eventually awarded the French Legion of Honor Chevalier class for his brave actions in France in 2012. At the end of the day, the officers that put up with McNiece's antics during training were proven correct. The war needed men like him. The Filthy 13 became an iconic and legendary unit, not only for its over-the-top looks, but also for its incredible combat deeds. Jake McNiece, with the help of historian Kaleo Griffith, would eventually document all of his wartime adventures in the book The Filthy 13, From the Dust Bowl to Hitler's Eagle's Nest, which only added more fuel to the legend. Vietnam, late 1960s. Hostile North Vietnamese troops pinned down a hatchet force of elite American MACV-SOG operators. They have the numbers and the high ground. Nevertheless, the Americans and their loyal indigenous montagnards do not back down. Staff Sergeant Jerry M. Shriver, also known as Mad Dog, dashes from cover to cover, pummeling the enemy with his unconventional arsenal of several pistols, revolvers, and a lethal sawed-off shotgun. Some men are wounded and are slowly hoisted up through the thick jungle canopy to a chopper. The enemy presses on, but Mad Dog does not flinch. He retaliates with all the ammunition at his disposal. The friendlies are lifted one by one until Mad Dog is left alone. He calls in for close air support several times. The enemy fire intensifies to the point that the radio offers Mad Dog Shriver assistance with a fresh unit of ground troops. He rejects the offers and replies, quote, No, I've got them right where I want them, surrounded from the inside." Jerry M. Shriver was born on September 24, 1941, in Defuniak Springs, Florida. Little is known about this man's life, except that he was destined to be an American hero, a decorated war veteran, and the embodiment of the actual fighting man. The soldier enamored with war and real brotherhood forged in the heat of battle. Shriver grew up with tales of veterans from World War II, those from the thousands of young men who enlisted to fight in the Pacific against the Empire of Japan and Europe, against the might of the Third Reich's Wehrmacht. Inspired by his country's heroes, Shriver joined the United States military at a young age, joining the Army from California. The young man proved his worth as a soldier and attended airborne school, becoming a paratrooper of the legendary Screaming Eagles of the 101st Airborne Division. Shortly after, Shriver tested his skills with the Army Special Forces, going through rigorous training to attain the cherished Green Beret of a true commando. At the time of Shriver's training, the tensions of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union had led the United States to support the government of South Vietnam after France's defeat in 1954 at the hands of the communist Viet Minh guerrilla. The nation had embarked on a conflict unlike any other it had fought. From the late 1950s until 1975, the Army would fight to the bitter end against a relentless enemy committed to turning Vietnam into a communist state. Despite the introduction of modern weaponry, such as jet aircraft, helicopters, heavily armored tanks, surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, guided missiles, and others, the Army desperately needed special operators trained to survive alone in the jungle and inflict heavy casualties on the enemy through unconventional warfare. Luckily for Staff Sergeant Jerry M. Shriver, he was one of them, and he wanted in. The thrill of the hunt had possessed him, and the territories of communist-infested Vietnam were about to become his hunting grounds. Jerry M. Shriver of the U.S. 5th Special Forces arrived in Vietnam in 1966. Tall and thin, with a narrow face, the operator had the personality of a man born for action. Future Medal of Honor recipient Jim Fleming would later describe Jerry Shriver as, quote, the quintessential wartime loner, antisocial, possessed by what he was doing, the best teammate, always training, constantly training. Shriver was not amicable to those outside his unit. His cold eyes were always battle-ready. He was born for combat and spent his free time training, inspecting his weapons, and learning about the terrain and enemy he sought to destroy to free Vietnam from communism. The staff sergeant was strict with his men, not to establish authority, but to make them better soldiers, machines of war, survivors in the jungle, and hunters of the night. Jim Fleming would also say that, quote, Shriver convinced me that for the rest of my life, I would not go into a bar and cross someone I didn't know. The staff sergeant was a lone wolf, who often spent the nights at the NCO's club, drinking a case of beer for himself, waiting for his next mission. During his first deployment in 1966, Shriver joined the elite and highly secretive MACV-SOG, or Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observation Group. Only the best of the best joined the unit. Chosen men from the Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, and CIA were part of this task force, created to tackle the most demanding missions. From 1966, and for almost 3.5 years, Shriver would keep extending his deployments as part of the battle frenzy that consumed him. He would spend over 1,000 days in Vietnam, getting to know its people, especially the Allied Montagnard forces. Shriver's exploits over the battlefield quickly earned him the nickname Mad Dog, and he truly lived up to it. Mad Dog's reputation grew after every mission. Shriver became addicted to the adrenaline of combat. He was at home in the jungles of Vietnam with the troops. Instead of catching a break after operations, he would sneak out and join other patrols that were bound to hunt down North Vietnamese or Viet Cong strongholds deep in the jungle. It is said that Shriver once took leave to get rest and recuperation, or R&R, except this was not his goal. Instead, the restless American warrior traveled to the Plei Jarong Special Forces camp to join another special operations team to fight alongside them. Most missions that MACV-SOG carried out were highly classified and remain so even now. But there's no doubt that Shriver saw some things beyond the familiar grunt. As the elite, MACV-SOG operators employed a unique Tiger Stripes camouflage uniform used by the South Vietnamese. They also had access to special equipment, such as the Colt Commando carbines, state-of-the-art bows for stealth encounters, and a never-ending supply of the latest armament. Like most of the men from MACV, Shriver had a unique way of dressing up. When off-duty, the legend often exchanged his combat fatigues for a blue velvet smoking jacket and derby hat. Nevertheless, Shriver was always armed to the teeth. He knew there were communist infiltrators everywhere and never let his guard down, especially after gaining notoriety among the enemy due to his exploits. It was common for other operators to see Shriver armed with 4 to 6 pistols or revolvers on his person, all of different calibers, from the old reliable and powerful M1911 to the lethal Magnum. Shriver's kit for combat operations was also unconventional. He, like others in MACV, would often employ enemy AK-47s, RPKs, and other guns that were not standard issue. Shriver carried a sawed-off shotgun, suppressed World War II-era M3 grease gun, or 45 caliber M1A1 Thompson submachine gun. There is a unique account of Shriver's arsenal during his second tour in Vietnam, when he went to MACV-SOG's Command and Control North for a debrief about a mission near the DMZ. Captain Jim Stoder recalled, quote, "He had pistols stuck everywhere on him. I mean, he had 5 or 6 38 caliber revolvers." The captain, bewildered about the sergeant's equipment, asked him, quote, "Sergeant Shriver, would you like a CAR-15 or M16 or something? You know the DMZ is not a real mellow area." Mad Dog grinned and laconically replied, quote, "No, those long guns will get you in trouble. And besides, if I need more than these, I got troubles anyhow." As time went by, the staff sergeant turned more eccentric. In 1968, the Vietnam veteran was forced by command for a mandatory rest period to the U.S. His teammate Larry White accompanied him to purchase a Marlin lever-action rifle chambered in the powerful .444 Marlin cartridge. Shriver did not plan on using such a powerful cartridge to hunt down grizzly and polar bears. He was thinking of taking down another type of prey. Shriver eventually shipped the rifle to MACV-SOG headquarters and said he would use it to bust bunkers and instill fear in the heart of the enemy with the massive exit wounds caused by the .444 Marlin cartridge. As a member of MACV-SOG, Shriver was a platoon sergeant of the secret hatchet force units. These small units comprised 2 or 3 American MACV-SOG members and 20 to 30 hand-picked locals from the Montagnard, or people from the mountain, and members of the South Vietnamese Army who were trained to fight unconventional warfare. These native Vietnamese were highly loyal to their American leaders and followed them until the end. The hatchet forces were a part of MACV-SOG and were tasked with unconventional warfare, reconnaissance, sabotage, and direct action missions deep behind enemy lines. These elite units gathered intelligence, disrupted enemy operations, and carried out special missions in the challenging terrain of Southeast Asia. Their activities were highly classified and often involved working with indigenous forces. Hatchet Force's name reflected their role as a quick, precise, and lethal tool in unconventional warfare. Shriver and his men excelled at this, to the point that Radio Hanoi, a communist radio station, announced a $10,000 bounty for his head. During one of the many over-the-top engagements where the enemy outnumbered Mad Dog Shriver and his men, he was establishing radio contact for air support when one of the operators asked him if he required an exfil, to which Shriver replied, quote, No, I've got them right where I want them, surrounded from the inside." Although Mad Dog Shriver was the loner, he was extremely fond of his trusty Montagnards. They were fiercely independent tribesmen who lived in the Vietnamese highlands and despised the communists. They were courageous in combat and had a unique ability to track anything that moved in the jungle. The men loved Shriver, and they rewarded him with their loyalty. In return, he spent most of his money on his men and their families. Food, clothing, and other donations were part of Shriver's constant flow of supplies to the mountain people. The Mad Dog spent most of his time with his Montagnards. He lived, ate, and slept inside their barracks. Besides his men, Shriver also had another friend, a large German shepherd named Klaus, whom he adopted in Taiwan. Shriver loved Klaus so much that upon learning of a cruel prank some NCOs played on his dog, force-feeding him with beer, Shriver walked into the NCO club with his .38 revolver and threatened the men. Not a single man dared to step forward and claim responsibility. After 3 years of continuous combat patrols, war began to take a toll on Mad Dog Shriver. He wanted to quit, but did not wish to leave his men and their families to their fate. Shriver felt danger was around the corner, but kept going forward. During the morning of April 24th, 1969, a MACV-SOG company prepared to raid the airfield at Quan Loi, South Vietnam, some 20 miles away from the secret lair of the Central Office of South Vietnam, the main HQ of the Communist forces. B-52 bombers had heavily pummeled the area, and it was now time for Mad Dog and his comrades to clean house. The operators were heavily armed and ready to get rid of the North Vietnamese garrison. Due to the secretive nature of the mission, Shriver and the rest of the MACV-SOG operators were on their own. There was no air support, unless it was essential. Before boarding the chopper with his Montagnards, Shriver turned to one of his friends and said, quote, "Take care of my boy." He felt it was the last time he would see Klaus. one of the Hueys failed and had to turn back, leaving Schreiber's 1st and 2nd platoons without valuable ground support. As soon as the men landed, they were immediately pinned down by several concealed machine gun nests. Mad Dog estimated his platoon was surrounded by 6 enemy platoons hidden in the bunkers. It was up to Mad Dog and his Montagnards to relieve the pinned-down men. He radioed the team that he would try to flank the machine gun positions, and immediately got to work. The fearless warrior inspired his loyal mountain men and charged toward the enemy emplacement. They began dashing through a hail of enemy bullets and grenades. Armed with an Uzi SMG, Mad Dog opened fire against the enemy while on the move to protect his troops, and they did the same for him. Once they approached the tree line, Mad Dog gathered his men, smiled at them, nodded, and they all threw grenades before venturing into hostile territory to shoot down the machine gun emplacement. Mad Dog Schreiber was never seen again. In the following weeks, Hanoi repeated propaganda pieces narrating how they had finally captured and terminated Schreiber, but no proof was ever given. In the following weeks, the military sent a cleanup team to recover the fallen soldiers, but there was no sign of Schreiber. He was less than 3 weeks away from finishing his 3rd tour of duty. Mad Dog was 27 years old when he was officially listed as missing in action. True to his spirit, the legend left behind a couple of dollars, his brave shepherd, Klaus, and his smoking jacket. To become a war chief of the Crow Nation, a man must do 4 things prized of a stealthy Crow warrior. 1. Touch an enemy without killing them. 2. Seize an enemy's weapon. 3. Lead a successful war party. And 4. Steal an enemy's horse. Surprisingly, one of the last men to ever complete these tasks did so not in the Wild West, but in the middle of World War II Europe. He was a U.S. soldier named Joe Medicine Crow, and he was to eventually become known as the last war chief. Joe Medicine Crow was born in the Apsalige, or Crow Tribe Reservation by Lodge Grass, Montana in 1913. In his own words, quote, "With incense of burning cedar and the singing of sacred songs, I came into the world. I was singing too, but they probably thought I was wailing." He was raised on the reservation by his Crow grandparents as custom dictated, learning from the rich war stories of his grandfather, White Man Runs Him, who was part of the Battle of Little Bighorn serving under Lieutenant George Custer. His father was also a war chief, and one of his great uncles had also fought in the Battle of Little Bighorn. The warring traditions were passed on to him and imprinted in his upbringing. He was taught to hunt, ride horses bareback, fight, and be honorable. His grandfather even encouraged him to run barefoot on the snow in sub-zero temperatures. After his tribal upbringing, Medicine Crow pursued higher education, gaining an associate degree, and then a bachelor's in sociology and psychology. He later even obtained a master's degree in anthropology from USC, being the first of his tribe to attain such an educational level. He was further working on earning a PhD in anthropology when World War II broke out, and his focus shifted to aiding the United States in the war effort. Medicine Crow worked briefly as a teacher at an Indian school, and then at a shipyard in Bremerton, Washington, before he enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1943, joining the 103rd Infantry Division. The Apsalige, or Crow, state 4 requirements that can make a man of the tribe a war chief. For the first task, the warrior must make physical contact with an opposing foe without ending their life. They call this a counting coup. For the second task, he must disarm an enemy. For the third task, he must lead a successful military expedition and live to tell the tale. For the final task, the warrior must steal a horse, a prized possession amongst Native Americans, from the enemy. As part of the 103rd Infantry Division, Medicine Crow was sent to the front line in France to fight in the war against German troops. Each time before entering a battlefield, Medicine Crow would put on his red war paint, made of ochre and water, on his arm beneath the uniform, and place an eagle feather under his helmet for holy protection. With his warrior heritage, he was more than prepared when on March 15, 1945, he was tasked with leading a squad of 7, each carrying explosives along the German Siegfried Line. This western wall on the other side of the French Magnot Line had been under assault by Allied forces since August of the previous year with alternating success. It was an apparent suicide mission. His commanding officer armed Medicine Crow and his team with TNT and indicated a bunker to target. The commanding officer reportedly told him, quote, "If anyone can do this, it's probably you." Leading the assault into enemy lines, dodging bullets and avoiding barbed wire, Medicine Crow successfully reached the bunker, along with his 7 men, and opened up a path past the Siegfried Line. Legend has it that Medicine Crow was the first American foot soldier to cross into German territory, but such a claim cannot be corroborated. With this success, he completed a step towards becoming a war chief, as he had led a successful military expedition and lived to tell the tale. Furthermore, this action would earn him U.S. military recognition in the form of a Bronze Star Medal for heroism. Once on enemy territory, the infantry division encroached on Musingen, where they fought the Germans on the streets. While pacing down an alley, Medicine Crow crashed into a German soldier, helmet against helmet. They both fell to the ground. With his own rifle, Medicine Crow yanked the German's rifle out of his hands, effectively disarming him and completing yet another step on his walk to becoming a war chief. Feeling that shooting a disarmed man would be dishonorable, Medicine Crow dropped his own rifle. According to accounts from Medicine Crow, the German and American instead struggled against each other in physical combat. The match ended with Medicine Crow wrapping his hands around the German's throat, ready to strangle him to death. Yet, with what little energy was left in him, the German cried out, "Mama," bracing himself for death. The shriek humanized the enemy soldier in the eyes of Medicine Crow, who calmed down and let go of him, effectively getting Crow closer to becoming a war chief, since he had performed a counting coup. It didn't take long for the Germans in the town to surrender, avoiding what could have been a slaughter, rather than a fight. All Joe Medicine Crow needed to do now was steal a horse, and he would be eligible to be titled War Chief by the Uppsala. However, horses were not as common in the field as tanks. It seemed like the final step would go unfulfilled. The very next day, the infantry division started to make its way to the Danube River. While scouting, the Native American noticed some enemies on horseback through his binoculars. The American soldiers sneakily followed the Germans back to a farmhouse that served as a station for senior officials. By spying on the station, Medicine Crow discovered that as many as 50 thoroughbred horses were kept in a corral. The commanding officer ordered an attack at the crack of dawn, but Medicine Crow did not want the horses harmed in the crossfire, so he asked permission to sneak in and liberate them. Medicine Crow armed himself with only a rope and a Colt 1911 pistol. Vigilantly, and moving with the stealth of a trained hunter, he walked by a shed where guards were resting. Once inside the stable, he recalled approaching the most beautiful and confident-looking horse. With his rope, he made a bridle, so he could maneuver the animal. He opened the corral gate, mounted the horse, and herded all 50 horses with a war scream. He rode away with the animals while singing a traditional Uppsala song, while the bombing of the farmhouse began, completing the last step to becoming a war chief. At the end of the war, he assisted in the liberation of a concentration camp in Poland by driving a jeep through the gates with his commanding officer. That was his last act of valor before returning to the U.S. Upon arriving to the reservation in Montana, he informed the elders of his actions during the war and was officially welcomed as a war chief, and in all likelihood, became the last war chief of the Crow tribe. After returning to his tribe as a war chief, Medicine Crow continued to serve his community. In time, he took the mantle of tribal historian and anthropologist. He labored as an appraiser for 32 years for the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, and continued to represent his tribe both at home and abroad. When the Crow Central Education Commission was established in 1972, he served as a member of the board. He continued to serve the commission, as well as the Traditional Circle of Indian Elders and Youth, which was formed in 1977. He participated in this council from its inception, with the purpose of preserving Native American culture, values, and views as they integrate with contemporary lifestyles and play a role in the political spectrum. He was asked to speak at the Custer Battlefield Museum, the College of Little Bighorn, and several other U.S. colleges during his life after the war.
At the turn of the century, he was asked to speak at the United Nations Summit, focused on religion and spirituality. Instead of speaking, he sang. In his own words, he, quote, sang a Crow Indian song welcoming all the spiritual leaders throughout the world to America, the land of Indian people. And I said something like this: when a white man makes peace, he writes it down on paper but soon breaks it. But when an Indian makes peace, he does so in his heart and never breaks it. When we stand side by side in the circle of no beginning and no ending, the first maker, creator of all things, is in the center. He hears the words of supplication and blesses us with his infinite love, which is peace itself. He concluded the doctorate that he'd been working on at the time that World War II broke out. Medicine Crow went on to publish a dozen books, recording the history, culture, and customs of the Crow tribe. War Chief was not the only title Medicine Crow obtained. He was granted 3 honorary doctorates, including one from his alma mater, USC, in 2003. He was knighted into the French Légion d'honneur, receiving the Chevalier Medal in 2008 for his feats during the Second World War. In addition to the Bronze Star given to him for breaching the Siegfried Line, he gained a World War II Victory Medal, a European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal, and a Good Conduct Medal from the American military. Finally, in August of 2009, President Barack Obama bestowed the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor granted by the United States, on Joe Medicine Crow for his dedication to the country and the Native American population. 95 years of age at the time, Crow performed and led a ceremonial dance afterwards. On April 3rd of 2016, Joe Medicine Crow passed away in Billings, Montana, after he had lived to the age of 102. He was buried with full military honors, and Governor of Montana Steve Bullock tweeted out about the war chief that he will, quote, forever serve as an inspiration for all Native Americans and all Montanans.
The German column was advancing toward the overwhelmed American troops. The Panzer Grenadiers were aboard armored vehicles and flanked by Panther tanks. The vanguard had already clashed with the American GIs and cornered them near a bridge. There was no way out for them. The Germans, slowly but steadily, made their way into the broken Allied lines, which, outnumbered, were in dire need of air support. But it was not possible. Both parties had suspended air operations due to the intense fog. But then, the unthinkable happened. The GIs, battered and exhausted, were about to surrender when the skies cleared and they heard an aircraft approaching. One of the German gunners from the rear then noticed that an old L-4 Grasshopper reconnaissance monoplane was racing through his comrades' lines as if it were making a bombing run. Before the German could realize what was happening, he fell to the ground with a concussion. Then came the sound of thunder and the emerging smoke from several of the armored vehicles that were now in flames. He stumbled and rose, only to hear the distant cheering from the GIs. As the Grasshopper got away, the German turned to the sky in amusement when he realized what had just happened. His lines had been decimated by 6 bazookas mounted on a silly little plane. Charles Carpenter was born in August 1912 in Edgington, Illinois. After graduating from Center College in Danville, Kentucky, he began teaching history. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Carpenter was already married, had a daughter, and was teaching at Urbana High School. In early 1942, Carpenter enlisted in the United States Army, like the tens of thousands of young patriotic Americans eager to avenge the Japanese strike. However, Carpenter saw himself serving in a different theater and fighting a different enemy, the Third Reich's unstoppable war machine. Carpenter was commissioned with the rank of second lieutenant and completed flight training to become a reconnaissance pilot. He was assigned to General George Patton's Third Army as an artillery spotter for the 4th Armored Division. The history teacher turned pilot was tasked with scouting to gather intelligence about enemy disposition and guide American artillery. Carpenter was pleased with his job as an artillery spotter. It was fairly safe. Enemy troops rarely fired against his inoffensive and unarmed reconnaissance airplane to avoid being detected. Nonetheless, as the war continued, Carpenter grew weary of his passive role as a spotter and sought to participate in more active combat roles. He had witnessed the horrors of war from above the clouds and was desperate to make a change. he decided to modify his civilian airplane and fit it with bazookas to take the fight against the might of German panzers. Carpenter was assigned to the 1st Bombardment Division following the Allied invasion of Normandy. The Army's L-4 Grasshopper aircraft was the lieutenant's warhorse. It was a slightly modified version of the civilian Piper J-3 Cub, an American design from the Piper Aircraft Company that debuted in 1938. The L-4 was a simple strut-braced monoplane costing just $2,500. It had an approximate weight of 1,220 pounds and a length of 22 feet. L-4 Grasshoppers had a cruising speed of over 80 miles per hour and could fly at 1,500 feet to spot the enemy. The monoplane was extremely versatile for reconnaissance missions, leading to the production of more than 5,400 units for military use. The aircraft had no armor or weapons. The only differences between its civilian counterpart was its olive drab plexiglass skylight and rear windows for increased visibility. Carpenter could remain airborne for over 3 hours and fly at low altitudes and as slow as 38 miles per hour to accurately gather intelligence for his artillery spotting duties. During the siege of Lorient in August 1944, Carpenter heard stories of pilots hanging weapons from their liaison airplanes to support ground troops fighting German infantry in armor. Carpenter obtained permission from his superiors to install 2 M1A1 bazookas to the side of his aircraft. After testing, Carpenter installed 4 more bazookas. On the side of his L-4, Carpenter painted the name Rosie the Rocketer to honor the women working in aircraft factories and set out to test his new armament in combat. Carpenter's bazookas fired 1 rocket-propelled anti-tank grenade with a battery-ignited toggle switch. The L-4 had a panel from which the pilot could decide to fire a single bazooka or all of them at once. The M1A1 bazooka could penetrate up to 3 inches of enemy armor, enough to put a Tiger tank out of commission if the rocket was fired from a 30-degree angle. German Panthers and Tigers were invincible from the front, but not from above, where their armor was thin. Carpenter exploited this during his artillery spotting missions. Carpenter's attack maneuvers were simple but risky. No one thought an unarmed L-4 could fight head-on against armored formations of panzers. In an article, Carpenter's daughter, Carol Apaki, would later write, quote, "It was like a sparrow trying to attack an elephant." After spotting an enemy tank from above, Carpenter's L-4 would quickly descend at an angle, fire the rockets, and drive away before the enemy realized what hit him. Carpenter began to immobilize tanks with his reckless tactics, earning him the nickname Bazooka Charlie after word got around that he had knocked out several armored cars and immobilized 1 Tiger and 1 Panther tank. Carpenter's exploits attracted the attention of the press, making him a relatable presence in the U.S. public, where he was known as the history teacher turned soldier. During one occasion, he said, quote, "Some people around here think I'm nuts, but I just believe that if we're going to fight a war, we have to go on with it, 60 minutes an hour, 24 hours a day." Bazooka Charlie was promoted to major and became General John S. Wood's private pilot, besides his artillery support missions. The major soon had more free time to fight against German armored units, and he did it so diligently that the Germans began to fire when they saw his Grasshopper in the sky. The pilot's exploits led the enemy to classify every L-4 as a threat to avoid tank casualties. The once peaceful reconnaissance mission soon turned into a matter of life and death, but that did not stop Bazooka Charlie from his rocket strikes. Like a bald eagle, the L-4 monoplane kept harassing the enemy from above, avoiding small arms fire when approaching its targets. After returning from one of his missions, Bazooka Charlie told a Stars and Stripes reporter that, quote, "Word must be getting around among the Germans to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." In September 1944, the American forces were battling Heer armored forces in the Battle of Aricourt near Nancy, France. Heavy fog had concealed the enemy units as they attacked American troops nearby. Visibility was low, and air support was unavailable in the area to avoid friendly casualties. Bazooka Charlie was in the skies, but could not provide support until the fog dissipated by noon. Around this time, Major Carpenter spotted an American support unit trapped under a bridge. The men were pinned down by a company of German armored tanks and some panzers. Shrapnel, explosions, and machine gun fire had immobilized the U.S. infantrymen, and their situation turned dire. Bazooka Charlie propelled himself into the heat of the combat without hesitation. The Major emptied his 6 bazookas during the first pass, but the enemy kept advancing. He raced to friendly lines to reload and returned to the bridge for a second pass. Despite the increasing German casualties, they kept advancing toward the GIs, forcing the Major to return for a third reload. During the desperate mission to save his countrymen, Bazooka Charlie fired 16 rockets at the enemy while being fired upon, immobilizing several armored vehicles, including 2 Panthers. The rest of the German troops retreated from the battlefield, allowing the support unit to survive. Carpenter's tenacity that day earned him a new nickname, the Mad Major. In another of his exploits, Carpenter was inspecting a possible landing field aboard a jeep near Avranches when a German unit attacked. The soldiers nearby tried to locate the enemy, who attacked from multiple locations. The Mad Major jumped into a nearby Sherman tank and manned the Browning machine gun. While providing support fire with a hail of bullets flying by, Carpenter shouted to the GIs, inspiring them to leave cover and push back the German soldiers. The soldiers and the Sherman began to advance toward the enemy, concentrating their fire and opening gaps in the formation. The Mad Major, turned leader of men, directed the fire of the Sherman and the infantrymen, forcing the Germans to retreat. Fueled by adrenaline, the GIs and the Mad Major went after the enemy. While firing against the Germans, Carpenter came upon Allied forces and accidentally fired at a bulldozer tank, blowing off the blade. The Mad Major was put under arrest and threatened with a court-martial, but the decision was overturned by General Patton, who stopped the trial and awarded Bazooka Charlie with the Silver Star for bravery. Patton said Carpenter was, quote, the type of American fighter he wanted in his army. When the war ended, Bazooka Charlie was officially credited with destroying 6 tanks, 2 of which were Tiger I tanks, but had immobilized more than a dozen. In addition to the Silver Star, Carpenter was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and awarded the Bronze Star, the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster. Upon his return to the U.S., Carpenter returned to his work as a history teacher and was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. Doctors gave the Mad Major 2 years to live, but the rugged pilot went on to live to the age of 53, enjoying what he loved the most, teaching. The Finnish army was forced to recruit men from the humblest origins to stand up against the Soviet Union in times of need. However, Simo Häyhä was no ordinary farmer. Growing up in the woods, Häyhä developed a knack for dealing with nature and learned hunting skills that far surpassed what he was taught during the short time he spent training with the Finnish military. Then, when the Soviets tried to seize Häyhä's homeland, the clever self-made sniper was ready to put up a fight, so much so that he earned the nickname of the White Death. Countless enemies would fall by his hand, and Häyhä would go down in history as one of the most lethal and humble snipers of all time. Three months after the outbreak of World War II, the Soviet Union trespassed the frontier with Finland, setting off an invasion known as the Winter War. The First Soviet-Finnish War officially started on November 30th, 1939, with the Soviets as a much superior force, both in tanks and aircraft. The Soviets had previously demanded Finland to cede a significant part of its territory, alleging security reasons. Leningrad was a crucial city that lay 20 miles from the border, and the Soviet Union expected it to provide enhanced protection against its enemies. However, Finland refused to capitulate, and the Soviets reacted violently. Several sources differ about the intentions of the Soviet Union and whether it strived to conquer the entire country and set up a puppet communist government, or if it only wanted to seize the established territory. Still, many battles ensued, with the main ones being Karelian Isthmus, Ladoga Karelia, and Kainuu. The Red Army suffered several losses and made little progress at first. When Joseph Stalin purged the Soviet army of military experts in the late 1930s, he unwittingly left his subordinates without proper leadership, and therefore vulnerable against small and defenseless countries. In addition to being terribly disorganized, Soviet soldiers were not provided with white camouflage uniforms, which didn't help in the Finnish winter, as their fragile figures were clearly identifiable against the snow. Finland managed to repel the Soviet advance and inflict substantial damage to the attackers for 2 months, while temperatures dropped to minus 45.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The Soviets had expected a full victory within weeks, just as they had done with East Poland shortly before, so they were taken completely off guard. They weren't counting on the courage of the soldiers from the Finnish People's Army, let alone the mastery of one particular sniper who was about to make history. Born on December 17, 1905, Simo Häyhä was the son of Juho and Katrina Häyhä. The family lived in Kiskinen, Rautjärvi, in the then Finnish region of Karelia. Growing up, he enjoyed his family's farm life, would often ski, and became a skilled hunter before joining the military. Häyhä spent much of his time in nature and hunting in the forests, thus acquiring several survival skills. When it came to hunting, he recognized early on that everything depended on the combination of the particular situation, the type of target, and more importantly, the terrain. Luckily, he had sharp vision and a natural talent to spot targets. The young man also learned another vital skill from his father, how to accurately estimate distances. While this particular ability was not natural, he developed it through practice. His precision was almost perfect, with a variation of merely a couple of steps. Likewise, he learned to measure the effects of wind and rain and the conditions of his surroundings. At 17, Häyhä joined the voluntary militia Civil Guard. He then became known for his shooting skills and excellent marksmanship. However, he never enjoyed the spotlight and was a rather timid and solitary man, even as he grew up. But whether he liked it or not, his extraordinary abilities soon raised a lot of attention. 2 years later, Häyhä began his compulsory military service with the Bicycle Battalion 2 in the Viipuri province. Simultaneously, he attended the non-commissioned officer school and served as a conscript officer in the Bicycle Battalion 1 in Terijoki. His sniper training in Uti wouldn't properly start until 1938, barely a year before the Soviets. Major Tapio Saarilainen, who interviewed Häyhä several times and wrote 5 books about his story, noted that while still a trainee with the Civil Guard, the young man hit a target 16 times from a distance of 150 meters in merely 1 minute. The author stated, quote, "This was an unbelievable accomplishment." When the war broke out, Häyhä participated in the Battle of Kola, where he celebrated his 34th birthday while on the battlefield. He was part of the 6th Company of Infantry, Regiment 34, under the command of Lieutenant Arno Juutilainen. Dressed in white attire, Häyhä was invisible to the incomers. He even hit 25 men in 1 day and instantly rose to fame amongst the snipers. He then became known as the White Death. As Finnish newspapers kept talking about the invisible soldier, the taika ampuja, or magic shooter, Simo Häyhä became a hero of mythical proportions. It's disputed whether the Red Army victims or Finnish propaganda efforts came up with the White Death nickname. However, both sides were very much aware of the sniper's reach. As usually happens with such a latent threat, Häyhä was targeted. The Finnish hero once hit an enemy sniper with a single shot, to which the Soviets counterattacked with indirect fire. The invaders shot a mortar bombardment near his position, but Häyhä emerged unscathed. Another time, an artillery shell almost hit him, but only brushed his greatcoat. Besides his extraordinary aim, Häyhä knew precisely how to remain hidden and had a stockpile of tricks. To begin with, the sniper would pour water on the snow before him, so his position wouldn't be revealed with a muzzle blast. He would then take a mouthful of snow to hide his breath. Moreover, he'd cover his movements with sounds, smoke, or even artillery fire when changing positions, and also memorize the best hiding spots on the battlefield, as he didn't have a map. Häyhä combined his natural talents with thorough preparation. During the night, he visited what he considered his favorite firing sites and improved them. Keenly devoted to his job, he would also clean his rifle more often than other soldiers, giving it maintenance before and after every mission. In such unbearable weather conditions, this helped avoid jamming. Perhaps his most notable mannerism was that he preferred his own old M2830 rifle over those equipped with telescopic sights. Despite it being a basic weapon, Häyhä considered his model reliable and consistent. Plus, he knew it well and had mastered it throughout the years. The sniper adjusted its sights for 150 meters, a standard distance for the time, which allowed flexibility to rapidly switch settings. Satalainen affirmed that Häyhä was able to estimate distances with accuracy between 1 and 150 meters. Furthermore, the biographer maintained that Häyhä would laugh when asked about a myth that snipers climb trees for better performance. The expert argued that on top of making it harder to keep steady and aim, it would render the sniper vulnerable if discovered, with no option to flee. Alternatively, Häyhä sought cover behind overhanging branches, where he was better protected and had a steady aim. Still, the hero was notably unafraid on the front line and said that he was just doing his job the way he approached hunting, always focused on ways to remain concealed while confusing the enemy. He also added that, quote, "War is not a pleasant experience, but who else would protect this land unless we are willing to do it ourselves?" The war lasted 105 days, but Häyhä would only serve 98. On March 6, 1940, he was hit by an explosive bullet in the face. According to his fellow soldiers, he was found after the battle unresponsive and placed on a pile of corpses. His commanding officer then sent someone to look for him, and the soldier noticed a twitching leg. Häyhä was in a coma and didn't regain consciousness until a week later, when an armistice had already been signed. As part of the agreement, Finland had to cede a significant portion of its territory, though it remained sovereign. In contrast, the Soviet Union's reputation was smeared, and the Soviets were expelled from the League of Nations. What's more, Adolf Hitler was encouraged by the Red Army's lacking performance and believed an attack on the Soviet Union would be successful. As for the Finnish hero, he found out about his own demise in a newspaper and wrote them personally to correct the misunderstanding. It took him 14 months and 26 surgeries to recover from his grave injuries, for which he would not be allowed to serve again in the continuation war against the Soviets. Consequently, Häyhä returned to his farm and always lived alone, until retiring in the Kimi Institute for Disabled Veterans in 2001. He passed away roughly a year later from natural causes at the age of 96. Simo Häyhä is still regarded by most experts as the most successful sniper in history. In 98 days, he had at least 505 confirmed hits, and when asked in 1998 about how he had become such a good sniper, he merely replied, quote, "Practice." On December 16th of 1944, 18 American soldiers from a reconnaissance platoon faced off against a German advance, outnumbered 27-1 in what would come to be known as the Battle of Lanzerath Ridge. The day-long confrontation saw the 18 soldiers battle 500 German paratroopers with such ferocity that the Germans believed a massive American fighting force must be waiting for them in the nearby woods. The deception would prove vital, as the platoon delayed the entire 1st SS Panzer Division for nearly 20 hours and set the stage for the Allies to win a decisive victory at the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was the last German offensive on the Western Front for World War II, lasting from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. The attacks were carried out in the woods of eastern Belgium to block Allied access to the port of Antwerp. The Germans hoped the audacious move would allow them to encircle and defeat all 4 enemy armies, forcing the Allies into a peace treaty beneficial to the Axis powers. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge took place over one day on December 16, 1944, and has been recognized as one of the first altercations of the greater Battle of the Bulge. It took place near Lanzerath, a Belgian village, along the trail pursued by the German Northern Shoulder advance. Before the battle, the U.S. Army had been attacking the German Roer River dams. After succeeding in breaking the German fortified lines, they expected a counterattack. Still, American intelligence failed to discern the hundreds of armored vehicles going their way and the thousands of soldiers about to attack. The border area between Germany and Belgium was often called a ghost front. Despite the quiet, however, the region held a vital network in the Losheim Gap, a narrow 5-mile-long valley. It was here that the Germans planned to use to send their 5th and 6th Panzer armies for a major offensive. The 18 American troops of the 394th Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon were well-trained but mostly inexperienced soldiers deployed to the Ardennes. Some of them were college-educated graduates of the by-then-defunct Army Specialized Training Program, which trained future personnel in engineering, foreign languages, or medicine. The platoon was commanded by one of the youngest officers in the entire Army, 20-year-old Lieutenant Lyle Boak. The platoon was formed by 2 reconnaissance squads of 9 men each. While highly trained for surveillance efforts, They were not prepared nor intended to directly engage with the Germans. Their main objective was to serve as a special intelligence agency for the regiment commander by collecting information and providing it to the regimental intelligence officer, such as the coordinates and size of the enemy forces. To do this, they operated patrol vehicles, observation posts, and coordinated intelligence activities across the regiment. They'd been living in the basement of a brick building in Höningen used to store the combat rations of the military. On the morning of December 16th, the two squadrons detected a significant German advance in the next town, but their communications were largely cut off from the higher headquarters, and they had no additional support. At the time, the majority of the American forces in the area were attacking the Siegfried Line through Valor Shield, 5 miles north of where the platoon was. Although they expected a counterattack, they were not expecting as great of a force as the Germans were sending their way. Lieutenant Boak and his team decided to build fortifications at Lanzerath on a hilltop edge of the forest overlooking pasture. They used foxholes left behind by a previous unit, but they dug deeper so that at least 2 or 3 more soldiers could fire from within while hidden. Each hole was then covered with pine logs. Their position gave them control over 300 yards of ridgeline to the northeast and allowed them to cover the fork in the road to their left. As it snowed, the Americans were made invisible to those who would soon travel the road below. They used a nearby log hut as a warming hut. They brought along the 4 additional carbines, 2 automatic rifles, and a light machine gun that Boak had added to the unit's arsenal. They also counted on a .5 caliber machine gun atop a jeep obtained by Boak through back channels. The platoon dug an emplacement for the jeep, placing it in an advantageous position to the road. They ran a jeep patrol each hour to maintain contact between their left and right flank units and to continue surveilling the enemy's movement. The team meant to serve as the eyes and ears of the 394th Infantry Regiment was forced into a combatant position which they were relatively unprepared for. The only direct order they received was to hold the area at all costs. Yet they expected to receive support and remained hopeful that their situation would change. Boak would later state in an interview with CNN, quote, "We weren't trained to occupy a defensive position in the front lines. We were trained to patrol and get information about the enemy." By that point in the war, most German units were formed by a combination of sprinkled seasoned veterans and a crew of untested young Germans who had rarely ever shot a gun before. During the invasion of Normandy, the Germans' 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, known for its effectiveness in combat, was mostly vanquished. To keep German morale, it had been rebuilt with members from the Luftwaffe field regiments. They carried the new STG-44 selective fire rifle and rifle grenades and were generally well armed. Yet the new recruits were still green and under the impression that the American soldiers were highly demoralized and unwilling to put up a fight. From this new 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, the 9th Regiment was ordered to head the attack on Lanzerath and wipe the village clean. They would then attack Hansfield and Brüllingen, where they believed they would face the bulk of the U.S. troops. The 6th Panzer Army, headed by Kampfgruppe Piper, would continue immediately towards the right flank to attack the route by Losheimer Graben directly after Lanzerath was taken. The German forces on their way to meet the small American platoon included 500 men of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment and 50 men from the Fusilier Regiment. Despite Germany's recent losses and the encroachment of the Allied forces on their territory, their morale was strong. They saw their line as the ultimate defense of their homeland. The attack began with a 2-hour-long rolling barrage. Thanks to the foxholes, the INR platoon was mostly unharmed. Unfortunately for them, the German soldiers cut their landlines without the possibility of asking for backup. By radio, the regiment was ordered to hold the area and send a patrol. The patrol watched as the large German unit emerged, intending to march through the town on the road in front of the hill with the foxholes, eventually taking them to the unprotected flank of the regiment. Upon return, the patrol wanted to withdraw, but Lieutenant Boak ordered the soldiers to remain in their foxholes as he hoped that their defensive strategy might stall the German army. The battle began without initial fire. The Germans rolled in with their commanders out in the open, perfectly positioned for the platoon to take out. Yet a young civilian girl reportedly left her house to warn them of the presence of the Americans. The German soldiers used roadside ditches to hide and shoot, while the Americans shot back from the foxholes. The Germans tried to attack the platoon from the front, but they had little at which to aim. The snow had rendered the platoon invisible. The defensive positions of the Americans was far superior, and the Fallschirmjäger Regiment bore the devastating effects of it. Back and forth shooting between the 18 men and the group of over 500 lasted all day. 3 concerted assaults were launched against the defensive position, and the 394th Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon defeated each one. German paratroopers charged in waves with little efficacy. Lieutenant Boak was set on fighting to the very last bullet to stall the Germans.
Yet they were not only threatened by the paratroopers present, but by the 1st SS Panzer Division coming up behind them. Eventually, the enemy fire destroyed the INR platoon's radio, ending all their communication with the outside world. Hundreds of Germans had fallen on the snow by the time the third wave of attacks was over, with only one American soldier wounded. Despite their early success, they knew that they couldn't hold a defensive position for much longer. Boak later stated in an interview with the New York Times, quote, "We were frightened and we were tired, and it was like a hellish nightmare. It seemed it would never end. We couldn't get any help. It seemed like it was all hopeless." The soldiers had been fighting on little or no sleep, they were freezing, and they were running out of munitions. Lieutenant Boak sought reinforcements or a formal withdrawal order by sending 2 soldiers to the regimental headquarters. They never made it. The Germans captured them. Lieutenant Boak was planning a withdrawal without consent from his superiors as his men ran out of ammo, but he never got to put his plan into action. As night fell on December 16th, 50 of the German paratroopers flanked the platoon and entered its perimeter. They cleaned out each foxhole on their way, capturing the American soldiers. Lieutenant Boak was injured in the leg by a German soldier who fired at his foxhole. Only one of the American soldiers was lost in action. Once they were all captured, the German paratroopers searched the woods for the humiliating revelation that they had been delayed by a tiny platoon. German Lieutenant Piper arrived at midnight, infuriated and frustrated at the delays resulting from the defense mounted by the INR platoon, as well as the terrible weather. These delays presented a significant problem for the tight timetable planned for the panzer units, which granted the U.S. Army highly valuable hours to prepare for the German attack. Reinforced, the U.S. Army was able to defeat the German units in the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The German Army was forced to shift its focus towards the south by means of its 5th Army for the remainder of the conflict. Lieutenant Boak turned 21 on December 17th while captive at Café Schollgen. The 17 platoon members were transported to multiple locations before being imprisoned at Stalag 13C in Nürnberg-Langwasser, a prisoner of war camp built on the old party rally grounds. The officers were sent to Oflag 13B instead in Hammelburg. The second camp had been built to hold 300 people, but instead held over 1,500 at the time of its liberation. The platoon members were liberated at the end of the war. The men of the INR platoon would become not only the most decorated of the Battle of the Bulge, but of World War II. The son of President Eisenhower, John S.D. Eisenhower, who commanded the Allied forces in Europe, credited their efforts with blocking an attack that could have resulted in the early destruction of the American position along the front lines. He believed that they received credit for the way the whole battle turned out. They were not awarded immediately after the war, but a petition to Congress successfully granted them 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Star Medals, and Bronze Star Medals for the remaining 9 soldiers. The most top-secret unit of the United States Army in the Vietnam War was established in January of 1964 and was called the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observation Group, but it was mostly referred to as MACV-SOG. Only the best of the best were recruited for the high-risk, high-reward missions that the unit carried out in South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Army Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, Air Force, and CIA personnel were among the bravest men that filled its ranks. MACV missions involved sabotage, strategic reconnaissance, personnel recovery, counterintelligence, and psychological operations, all behind enemy lines. And stories of 10-man units that held off against thousands of communists were common. However, more than half of those who enrolled did not return from their missions. But this did not stop MACV-SOG from becoming the unit with the highest kill-death ratio in American history. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954 proved that the French army and the renowned French Foreign Legion were incapable of defending their colonial territory from the expansion of communism, and the French dominion in Vietnam or Indochina ended in 1955. What followed echoed the aftermath of the Korean War. The Vietnamese population was divided. Some favored the European way of life to keep practicing their Catholic faith inherited by the French missionaries, while others preferred complete ideological independence from any foreign power and opted for communism. North Vietnam, aided by the Soviet Union and China, wanted to take over the South, which had the support of France, the United States, and other members of the United Nations. The U.S. had discreetly begun to send army advisors to train and support the South Vietnamese. In the early 1960s, President John F. Kennedy increased support for its Asian ally, but refused to send American military personnel to prevent another war. Still, Green Berets were sent to Vietnam to form a South Vietnamese Special Forces group that would be known as the First Observation Group. Aided by both the U.S. Department of Defense and the CIA,
The men of this unit had the objective of becoming the main line of defense against a possible Chinese invasion of South Vietnam. As the number of candidates increased, the first observation group was deployed in 15-man groups to conduct guerrilla warfare against the communists, and after a North Vietnamese attack on Laos in 1961, President Kennedy gave the green light to expand the first operation group's area of operations throughout all of Vietnam. Still, this was not enough, and more American soldiers were required for highly perilous missions. To prevent the expansion of communism and give an edge to the South Vietnamese, the United States decided to create a classified unit that could operate in small numbers behind enemy lines to gather intelligence and sabotage the communist plans. The unit was initially called the Studies and Observation Group, or SOG, and it was controlled by the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities at the Pentagon. Born out of a need to establish a more aggressive stance against the spread of communism in Laos, Cambodia, and all of Asia, another unit was created to broaden the capabilities of SOG personnel in Vietnam. A Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observation Group was activated on January 19, 1964 by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a subsidiary command of the Military Assistance Command. Enlisted men often referred to the unit as MACV-SOG, and it was created to function as a Joint Special Operations Task Force. After the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, the military no longer trusted the CIA in organizing paramilitary organizations. It was then established that MACV would be led by a Special Forces colonel and formed by top-tier personnel from all the American military factions and the CIA. This included a rigorous selection of men from the ranks of the Army Special Forces, Air Force, Navy SEALs, and Marine Corps Force Recon. According to the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group Annex A Command History from 1964, MACV's official mission was to, quote, execute an intensified program of harassment, diversion, political pressure, the capture of prisoners, physical destruction, acquisition of intelligence, generation of propaganda, and diversion of resources against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. From 1964 onward, small groups of elite MACV personnel aided by South Vietnamese commandos would make high-altitude, low-opening parachute jumps behind enemy lines to wreak havoc in the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Laos, and Cambodia. Robert Seals from the U.S. Army History Office stated that, quote, MACV-SOG grew in size and scope over the next 8 years. Missions evolved over time and included strategic reconnaissance, direct action, sabotage, personnel recovery, psychological operations, counterintelligence, and bomb damage assessments. Maritime operations covered the coastal areas of North Vietnam. PSYOP missions included Voice of Freedom radio broadcasts into North Vietnam to publicize the advantages of life in South Vietnam. MACV's involvement in Vietnam began during the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On the night of July 30th, 1964, 4 MACV boats shelled 2 islands off the coast of North Vietnam. When the MACV boats were gone, North Vietnamese torpedo ships retaliated and pursued the USS Maddox destroyer. This led the United States to declare war against North Vietnam. Once the US was entirely involved in the war, MACV operatives were cleared in September of 1965 for Operation Shining Brass, the infiltration of Laos to conduct reconnaissance missions in the Ho Chi Minh Trail. With the help of the 7th Air Force, MACV carried out strategic bombardments in the zone with devastating effects. During one of the bombardments, Special Forces Captain Larry Thorne, a World War II legend that had fought the Soviets as part of the Finnish Army and the elite German Waffen-SS, became MACV's first casualty after his Huey crashed. By late 1965, MACV was split into 3 regions: Command and Control North, Command and Control Central, and Command and Control South, while the main quarters were established in Saigon. Each site operated independently and reacted according to its own particular situation. Teams were mostly made up of 10 men, of which 2 to 4 were Americans, and the rest were either Vietnamese, Cambodian, or Chinese commandos. Robert Seals added that, quote, each mission was unique, but most followed a similar tactical profile. After being alerted of a mission, the reconnaissance team was briefed and conducted detailed planning, rehearsals, inspections, and training, time permitting. Teams were inserted by helicopter into the target area. Like World War II Waffen-SS units, MACV teams were given considerable freedom in terms of the many tactics they could employ to accomplish their objective, as well as the weapons, uniforms, and equipment they could carry. Enemy equipment was often used, especially firearms like the AK-47 and RPK, to confuse the enemy during firefights. In addition, while deep in the jungle, MACV-SOG units kept close communication with forward air control fixed-wing aircraft for close air support and immediate extractions when missions went wrong. Most operations lasted from 3 to 7 days, and it was not uncommon for the 10-man squads to be surrounded by hundreds of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops. MACV-SOG reconnaissance casualties were exceedingly high, but the unit still achieved the highest kill ratio in United States military history, averaging 158 to 1 during the last 3 years of the Vietnam War. John L. Plaster, former MACV veteran and author of the book SOG, The Secret Wars of America's Commandos in Vietnam, served 3 tours as a long-range recon leader, gathering information about the enemy in Laos and Cambodia. In his book, Plaster gathered the testimonies of over 100 members of SOG and their almost unbelievable acts of heroism during the war. One of them involved the bravery of the 14 men from Recon Team Kansas and how they stood against an entire NVA regiment, while another recognized the Recon Team Colorado and how they defeated a formation of over 300 North Vietnamese by placing 8 Claymore mines in their way. The volunteer teams often found themselves escaping from the Hornet's Nest, but there was a cost to pay for such bravery. Of the 58 MACV-SOG personnel captured by the enemy, only one of them survived. The rest were never released. Charles Wilclow is the only known survivor who made it out, after the North Vietnamese army believed he would not make it because of his wounds. The American withdrawal from Vietnam strongly affected SOG in 1972. The personnel was reduced, but they kept infiltrating enemy lines to strike from the rear and halt entire NVA battalions with guerrilla warfare tactics. 9 men from MACV-SOG, including Gary Rose, Lauren Hagen, Robert Howard, Tom Morris, and Franklin Miller, were awarded the Medal of Honor, and another 22 were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Mexican-American Staff Sergeant Roy Benavides was the last MACV-SOG member to receive the Medal of Honor from the hands of President Ronald Reagan after the unit was declassified in the late 1980s. 2 decades later, the unit itself was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation during a ceremony held at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Several MACV veterans have written about their time in the Vietnam War, and Plaster's book has been continually used as a reference by the media to tell the soldiers' story. The legendary MACV-SOG unit has been featured in many movies and video games, like the Call of Duty series, the Arma games, and most famously in Francis Ford Coppola's classic film Apocalypse Now. One of the Pacific theater's most brutal battles during World War II was the conquest of the island of Saipan in the summer of 1944. Part of Operation Forager, the Battle of Saipan was a U.S. offensive against Japanese ground and naval garrisons stationed in the Mariana, Palau, and Caroline Islands. Sergeant Thomas Alexander Baker, a young soldier of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, was part of the American forces that faced intense fire and ambushes as they advanced toward the island's center. Fatally wounded after American forces successfully repelled a 5,000-strong Japanese counterattack, Sergeant Baker asked to be left behind. The battalion was running out of ammunition, and he was not willing to risk other soldiers' lives for his own. Baker knew his time had come, and was ready to embrace it with a heroic last stand. He asked his comrades to lay him down near a tree to hold back the incoming Japanese. With no ammo left to share, one of his friends gave him a pistol with 8 rounds. As U.S. forces later returned to the battle scene, they witnessed firsthand the fighting spirit of the American warrior. The island-hopping campaigns at the Pacific Theater in World War II were far more gruesome than what the American forces had faced in the Western Front. The level of violence experienced by soldiers in the Pacific was only comparable to that at the Eastern Front. There, Germans and Soviets were engaged in a bitter battle where every inch of land was fought to the last man. If the Germans had to endure the freezing weather of the vast Russian landscape during the first 3 years of the conflict, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps had to withstand the Pacific's hot tropical jungle heat for 5 long years. The heat, rain, and natural wildlife of the Pacific Islands posed a severe threat to Americans' health. It was no easy feat to fight against the environment, but the enemy was even harsher. The United States Marines, the smallest branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, were pitched against brave and restless Japanese warriors intensely loyal to Emperor Hirohito. Educated under the ancestral samurai code of Bushido, the Japanese soldiers, sailors, and Marines of the Imperial Japanese Army were taught to never surrender, even against staggering odds that threatened their lives. As far back as the 1920s, Japan had grown into a formidable military force that aimed to become the Pacific superpower. Before World War II broke out, the Empire of the Rising Sun had taken over most of Asia through a series of brutal campaigns in the late 1930s. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 after the U.S. oil embargo, the American armed forces did not have enough men or firepower to retaliate. But that would quickly change. When the Americans won the decisive naval Battle of Midway in 1942, which many historians consider the Pacific Theater's turning point, the Imperial Japanese Navy realized that they had underestimated their enemy. U.S. forces would continue to fight back until Japan surrendered. To do so, the U.S. realized that the only way to reach the heart of Japan was to eliminate the fortified Japanese garrisons scattered all over the Pacific Islands. As U.S. forces got closer to mainland Japan, resistance became unrelenting. Japanese soldiers were willing to fight to the end before surrendering. Headstrong banzai charges and suicidal kamikaze crashes were some of the tactics employed to inflict as much damage as possible to the enemy. but the young Americans quickly adapted and retaliated with the same ferocity, conquering island after island with a newfound display of courage. Wake Island, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and many other islands succumbed to the brave American forces. But then came Saipan, one of the bloodiest and most harrowing encounters of the Asian conflict. The Battle of Saipan lasted from June 15th to July 9th, 1944. During almost a month of continuous conflict as part of Operation Forager, the U.S. Army lost around 14,000 soldiers out of an invading force of 70,000 men. The Japanese defenders lost 29,000 soldiers out of a 32,000-men battalion. But over 22,000 Japanese civilians living on the island perished when the Americans finally took over. Some were lost to starvation, others to indirect fire from both armies. Thousands of civilians gave up their own lives because Japanese soldiers told them that they would be either enslaved, tortured, or executed by the invading forces. Saipan and its surrounding islands were a top priority for the U.S. command. If conquered, bombers could be placed within the range of mainland Japan. Aboard 300 tracked landing vehicles, over 8,000 U.S. Marines landed on Saipan's west coast under cover of artillery bombardment on June 15th. As the men began to establish a beachhead, the Japanese waited. The Americans had previously placed flags on shore to set up a perimeter. When the beach was packed with amphibious tanks, Marines, and supplies, the Japanese opened fire. Sergeant Thomas Alexander Baker Jr., a young private from Company A of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, was among the first men to storm the coast. While the Marines fought on the west side, Sergeant Baker's regiment landed on Saipan's southern end on June 17, 1944. They initially met fierce Japanese resistance, but were able to make their way into the mainland. On June 19th, when the 105th was on its way to Nafutan Point, it was bogged down by Japanese pillboxes. Private Baker stormed ahead with a bazooka and single-handedly knocked down a Japanese emplacement. Along with his M1 rifle, he then cleared the path for his unit. As the battle continued, Nafutan Point was still a coveted spot for both sides. By June 27th, enemy resistance was reduced to 1,200 combatants. The Japanese eventually surrendered after being completely surrounded and under the heavy barrages of naval artillery. As Americans advanced through rugged terrain, many were injured or put down by enemy fire coming from concealed positions along the cliffs and caves. The area became known as Death Valley or Purple Heart Ridge. On the way to Mount Tepachau, the 105th had to move through the valley's thick jungle and cross a flat plateau where there was no cover. The men were exposed to enemy fire coming from high ground. While his unit advanced, Private Baker was assigned to a rear security position to prevent a Japanese counterattack. Most of the 105th had already gone through the opening when Baker spotted movement nearby. According to his posthumous Medal of Honor citation, Private Baker, quote, came upon 2 heavily fortified enemy pockets manned by 2 officers and 10 enlisted men which had been bypassed. Without regard for such superior numbers, he unhesitatingly attacked and killed all of them. 500 yards farther, he discovered 6 men of the enemy who had concealed themselves behind friendly lines and destroyed all of them. After the unit successfully crossed the opening thanks to Baker's team, the 105th joined the 23rd Marine Regiment and captured the villages of Dane and Hasigoro. By July 5th, the Japanese had nowhere left to go. Marines and Army soldiers had almost taken over the island. Only the Tanapag Plain remained under Japanese control. American forces had firmly dug themselves in the area to prevent anyone from getting out. The Japanese prepared for one last desperate attack. The 105th was dug west of Tanapag near a railroad. On July 6th, the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, decided to launch a desperate and violent final banzai charge. Over 5,000 Japanese fixed their bayonets and got ready for close-quarters combat. Private Baker's perimeter was attacked from 3 sides. He was wounded twice by Arisaka rifle fire, but he kept fighting back. He emptied all his M1 carbine ammo and resorted to his .45 caliber 1911 handgun. When none of his comrades had any ammunition left, Baker got out of his foxhole and started charging Japanese soldiers by swinging his carbine as if it were a war club. After putting down a dozen soldiers, Baker was shot in the stomach and began to bleed out. The perimeter became indefensible and was overrun. As Baker's comrades were dragging him out to evacuate, one of them was shot. Refusing to let any of his brothers in arms die for him, Baker asked them to leave him behind. There was no point in risking more lives for him. After repeated refusals, his comrades left him in a sitting position near a tree. Baker's only request was to be given a pistol to keep fighting the Japanese. Before withdrawing, a soldier gave him a 1911 handgun with just 8 bullets remaining. There was no more ammunition. When American forces returned to the battle scene, they found Private Baker in the same position he had been left. The pistol he was holding was empty, and 8 Japanese soldiers lay around him. All of them had been shot by one .45 caliber pistol round. For his bravery beyond the call of duty during the Battle of Saipan, Private Baker was promoted to sergeant on May 9, 1945, and posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. It was a heroic last stand, and an emblematic display of courage that many unknown soldiers also showed in the war. Admiral and Commander of the Pacific Fleet, Chester W. Nimitz, would later say that the war was a conflict in which, quote, uncommon valor was a common virtue. On the night of May 15, 1918, Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts were patrolling a bridge on the Argonne Forest's western side. Johnson, a black American soldier, had been dispatched to France in 1918 to aid the French army in its battle against the Germans. When his companion fell asleep, Johnson began hearing a strange noise that only became louder with time. When Roberts refused to wake up, Johnson started preparing his weapons, including a French bayonet and an American bolo knife. His suspicions were proved right when he noticed several German soldiers approaching them. Johnson was terrified, but instead of running, he decided to fight. And thus ensued a battle of one American man against dozens of German soldiers. Johnson's one-man army took out 4 soldiers and wounded many, many more. Although Johnson's story is one of true courage and heroism, history condemned him to oblivion for many years because of the color of his skin. According to Henry Johnson himself, he was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, circa July 15, 1892. Other research states that Johnson could have been born as early as 1887 or as late as 1897. After moving to New York in the early 1900s, Johnson, just like every other teenager, took on an assortment of odd jobs such as chauffeur, soda mixer, server, coal yard worker, and railway porter. In the spring of 1917, Johnson read in a newspaper that the 15th New York Infantry Regiment of the New York National Guard, comprised entirely of black soldiers, was accepting enlistees. Johnson, a scrawny and short man, showed up in June 1917 ready to serve his country. He was assigned to Company C of the 15th, later referred to as the 369th U.S. Infantry Regiment. He was dispatched to Camp Wadsworth in South Carolina. Johnson's primary duties were hard labor, such as unloading supply trucks and digging up for latrine installation. Although black men had served in the American military since the Independence War, they were considered inferior and received segregated training. It was also during this time when Johnson met and subsequently married his wife, Georgina Etna Jackson. It was 1918, and World War I was in its final stages. France was suffering from a shortage of men, so the U.S. agreed to send the 369th Infantry Regiment. Their commander, Colonel William Hayward, positively believed in his men's abilities and lobbied for them to have their chance in combat. And so, the 369th, which later became known as the Harlem Hellfighters, finished their hard labor duties and were welcomed into the 161st Division of the French Army. They were even given jackets and helmets belonging to the foreign military. In March 1918, Johnson and his fellow soldiers began taking French lessons to understand their superiors' commands. They were given French rifles and were allowed to hold on to their American bolo knives. Although the knife was heavy, Johnson would later be grateful for this unassuming weapon. After joining the trenches that same month, Johnson was paired up with fellow American Needham Roberts and assigned sentry duty on the Argonne Forest's western side. On the night of May 15th, both men were on duty patrolling near a bridge when their most unforgettable night began. As their night shift wound down, Johnson spotted 2 relief soldiers approaching the area. Since the men were younger than him and thus less experienced, he did not want to leave them alone, so he stayed to survey the area. It was then that Johnson began to hear strange noises. He ran back to the trench where Roberts was resting and attempted to wake him up. But his fellow soldier was tired, and believing Johnson was being paranoid, asked him to relax. But Johnson would not give in, and began preparing his weapons, piling up an assortment of cartridges and grenades. The noises became louder and louder. At one point, Johnson heard a clipping noise, which he thought to be the perimeter fence being cut by bolt cutters. He again tried to wake up Roberts, but this time he said, quote, "Man, you better wake up pretty soon, or you might never wake up." When Roberts heard the clipping noise, he and Johnson began lobbing grenades into the darkness in hopes that whoever was around would run back to where they came from.
Suddenly, dozens of German soldiers with bayonets appeared out of the darkness, firing at them. The Americans were surrounded and heavily outnumbered. When Roberts tried to run for help, he was hit by a grenade shrapnel in his arm and hip. Still awake, he handed Jackson more grenades. When those ran out, Johnson began firing his rifle at the Germans, all while being hit by bullets all over his body. Stunned by the commotion, a confused Johnson tried to arm his French rifle with an American cartridge. However, they were incompatible, and the weapon jammed. With the Germans coming closer and closer to him, Johnson began using his unusable rifle as a club to hit as many Germans as he could. When the butt of his rifle fell apart, Johnson also went down to the ground after being hit in the head. But Johnson didn't stay down. The soldier stood back up, drew his American bolo knife, and charged it at every German he encountered. When Johnson saw that the Germans were trying to haul Roberts away, he ran to the scene and attacked more and more soldiers. This grisly scene lasted for about an hour, with Johnson hacking and stabbing even as bullets continued to strike him. When the reinforcements arrived, the remaining Germans fled the scene. Johnson and Roberts were taken to an army hospital, where they received medical attention. Both men survived. Johnson was shot 5 times on his feet, thigh, arm, and head. He had a large scar on his lip and a large bruise on his torso, where a bayonet had been plunged in. In total, Johnson suffered over 21 injuries as a result of his one-man battle against the Germans. When French military officials visited the scene of the battle, they encountered a grisly scene. The ground was permeated with pools of blood, German helmets, and 4 bodies. Johnson's superiors estimated that he had wounded 25 Germans. Thanks to his bravery, Johnson prevented the German group from breaking the French line. The story spread around fast. The bridge where Johnson and Roberts had spent their shift became known as the Battle of Henry Johnson. American officials gave him the unofficial nickname of Black Death and promoted him to sergeant. Before Johnson and Roberts returned to America, the French army honored them with the Croix de Guerre, an award for valor. They were the first 2 Americans to receive such an honor. Johnson's medal was also amended with a Gold Palms edition, given to men who have demonstrated extraordinary valor. However, when the men arrived in the United States, the story was vastly different for them. Back in New York, Johnson recuperated from his injuries while the country celebrated his bravery, albeit with a clear difference from his white counterparts. Johnson was a national hero, but he was also black. In the parade that honored the Harlem Hellfighters in 1919, the men could not march with the white soldiers. After Johnson's honorable discharge, the army used his image to recruit new black soldiers and sold victory war stamps with his face on them. Unfortunately, just like his early years, Johnson's life after his brave battle is plagued with mystery. Despite his extensive list of injuries, Henry Johnson attempted to make a life for himself and his family. As an uneducated young black man in his 20s, Johnson returned to New York, where he worked as a red-cap porter at the train station. However, he never could overcome his injuries. His discharge records erroneously made no mention of his wounds. Thus, Johnson was denied a Purple Heart and a disability allowance as well. His inability to hold down a job, as well as pain from his shattered foot, eventually led him to the bottle. Over the years, he became estranged from his family, and his wife and children eventually left him. On July 1st, 1929, Henry Johnson passed away of myocarditis, a type of heart inflammation, destitute and homeless. He was only 32 years old. A brave and selfless man who had earned the nickname Black Death in combat was soon forgotten. However, over the years, Henry Johnson's legacy has been recognized by several political figures. Co-founder of the American Legion, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, once called Johnson one of the 5 bravest Americans to serve in World War I. In 1996, President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded Henry Johnson the Purple Heart. For decades, the location of Johnson's remains was a mystery. It wasn't until 2002 when researchers at the New York Division of Military and Naval Affairs investigated his service and determined that he had been buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. After this confirmation, Johnson was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross the following year. In 2015, President Barack Obama awarded Henry Johnson the Medal of Honor, which was accepted on Johnson's behalf by Sergeant Major Lewis Wilson of the New York National Guard. In his remarks at the presentation, the president stated, quote, "Now America can't change what happened to Henry Johnson. We can't change what happened to too many soldiers like him, who went uncelebrated because our nation judged them by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. But we can do our best to make it right." Every June 5th, Albany celebrates Henry Johnson Day, acknowledging the day he began his Army service. The city also gives out a Henry Johnson Award for distinguished community service for citizens making contributions in the area. Despite his undeniable bravery, Johnson, a humble man, begrudgingly referred to his heroic and selfless act almost as if it were of no significant consequence. According to him, quote, "There wasn't anything so fine about it. I just fought for my life. A rabbit would have done that."